Addis Ababa, 1974. She does not want to remember, but she is here and memory is gathering bones. She has come by foot and by bus to Addis Ababa, across terrain she has chosen to forget for nearly 40 years. She is 2 days early, but she will wait for him, seated on the ground in this corner of the train station, the metal box on her lap, her back pressed against the wall, rigid as a sentinel. She has put on the only dress she does not wear every day. Her hair is neatly braided and sleek, and she has been careful to hide the long scar that puckers at the base of her neck and trails over her shoulder like a broken necklace. In the box are his letters. Le lettere, ho scoperto le mie lettere, il mio segreto, Hirut, anche il tuo segreto, segreto, secret, mister. You must keep them for me until I see you again. Now go, vatene, hurry before they catch you. There are newspaper clippings with dates spanning the course of the war between her country and his. She knows he has arranged them from the start, 1935, to nearly the end, 1941. In the box are photographs of her, those he took on Fucelli's orders and labeled in his own neat handwriting. Una bella ragazza, una soldata feroce, and those he took of his own free will, mementos scavenged from the life of the frightened young woman she was in that prison, behind that barbed wire fence, trapped in terrifying nights that she could not free herself from. Inside the box are the many dead that insist on resurrection. She has traveled for 5 days to get to this place. She has pushed her way through checkpoints and nervous soldiers, past frightened villagers whispering of a coming revolution and violent student protests. She has watched while a parade of young women, raising fists and rifles, marched past the bus taking her to Bahar Dar. They stared at her, an aging woman in her long drab dress, as if they did not know those who came before them, as if this were the first time a woman carried a gun, as if the ground beneath their feet had not been won by some of the greatest fighters Ethiopia has ever known. Women named Aster, Nardos, Ababech, Sadale, Aziza, Hanna, Maaza, Ainadis, Dabru, Yodit, Ililta, Ababa, Qiddist, Balainish, Maskaram, Nunu, Tigist, Sahai, Makbib, Saba, and a woman simply called the cook. Hirut murmured the names of these women as the students marched past, each utterance hurling her back in time until she was once again on ragged terrain, choking in fumes and gunpowder, suffocating in the pungent stench of poison. She was brought back to the bus, to the present, only after one man grabbed her by the arm as he took a seat next to her. If Mussolini couldn't get rid of the emperor, what do these students think they are doing? Hirut shook her head then. She shakes her head now. She has come this far to return this box, to rid herself of the horror that staggers back unbidden. She has come to give up the ghosts and drive them away. She has no time for questions. She has no time to correct an old man's pronunciation. One name always drags with it another. Nothing travels alone.
Hi, everybody. Thank you for inviting me. It's such an honor to be speaking at this inaugural Asmara Addis Literary Festival in Exile. So about every 1.5 years, there is a solar eclipse that takes place somewhere on our planet's surface. And a solar eclipse is basically when the moon, when the Earth, the moon, and the sun are aligned in what is known as a syzygy, which is basically when 3 celestial bodies or more are aligned in a perfectly straight line. And whenever this happens, you have thousands of people who flock to witness the solar eclipse from all around the world. And they give testimony to that witnessing this syzygy transforms their lives. They say things that it gives them a shift in perspective because they see the world from the moon at the center, and that world is a mysterious world and a luminous world and a world in which the pace is a bit slower than they're accustomed to. And they share that these are events where there's a sense of unity and rejoicing. And of course, in many cultures, the moon is symbolic to the feminine, while the sun is symbolical to the masculine. And I don't necessarily intend to make that kind of spiritual and somewhat essentialist connection, but I do want to connect the story of the solar eclipse and the moon with the silencing of women that takes place in our societies, and which is a great loss to all of us. And this is a silencing that I learned about from a very young age. So I grew up in Lagos, in Nigeria, a city that I found to be really exciting and magical. So I was quite a patriotic child, by which I mean that I was aware of my fondness for my city. And I used to go roaming around my neighborhood, pretending that I was an explorer, and I would discover streets that I didn't know about before and things like that. But I was also an observant child, and I noticed that Lagos and my country was a patriarchal one, even though I didn't have that terminology at the time. But I noted that men had much more power than women. They were the heads of state, the heads of the army, the heads of schools, the heads of companies, the heads of the family, blah, blah. But I simultaneously had a really strong feminine presence in my life. So there was my mother who filled my mind with knowledge, with stories and feminist books. And then there was Margaret, who was our house help, and she came from an underprivileged background, but she was, or therefore perhaps, she was a very strong and inspiring and affirming woman. And I loved her like a mother, and she loved me. And there were my two aunties. So I lived in quite a typical West African family household. So my dad's two sisters also lived in the same house. And so did my grandmother, intermittently. And my grandmother was an Iya Oloja, which in Yoruba is a chief market woman. So she had a lot of bravado, and she was a great storyteller. And so when I came home from school or wherever I'd been, and I would be surrounded by these women's stories and their laughter and sometimes their tears, I was aware that it was of a shift. I was aware that in my cocoon, in this home, the world was very different to the world outside. And in order to make sense of these parallel and confusing and disturbing worlds in many ways, I did what I've been doing ever since. I wrote. I wrote in my journals, I wrote in pamphlets, I wrote in my school magazines. Many years later, when I was a teenager, I moved to Sweden, and there I had to encounter yet another layer of society's problems, which was racism, that I experienced sometimes on a physical and a violent level. And again, I wrote. And in my 20s, I moved to Spain, and then I moved to New York, and eventually to London, where I've resided ever since. And by this time, I was already a feminist. I was anti-capitalist, anti-imperialist, anti-racist. And there was a word that people would always throw at me whenever I expressed my views, and that word was militant. Why are you so militant? Stop being so militant, people would say. And so again, I took refuge in words. I wrote. I eventually started a blog, Ms. Afropolitan, which I still run. And I am now writing a book titled Sensuous Knowledge. And I am still writing because writing is the place where the world makes the most sense to me. It's the place where I heal, but it's also my space for resistance. And through all this writing, I discovered that words are incredibly powerful. I don't think we fully grasp the extraordinary power that words have in transforming people's lives and in transforming society. But I therefore also discovered that words are very dangerous, and that this is why our societies don't want women to speak. But it's very important to understand that patriarchal society does not necessarily seek to silence women who... Basically, it's okay for women to speak so long as they're not challenging the status quo, so long as they're cuddling the patriarchy. But as soon as a woman speaks from a female-centered point of view, she will face consequences. They can be minor, such as being ostracized or alienated or ridiculed. But at worst, she's persecuted or even murdered. And so what I eventually really learned is that to speak with yourself at the very center is a dangerous act. But it is our human right to exist and to share our perspectives, whether it's on the society or the environment or the economy or on culture. It is a human right for women to speak. But of course, the patriarchy will continue to try to silence us. Men are accustomed and socialized to living in a world that places men at the center. And so men do not want a male eclipse, if you like. But every man knows that the best way to control a woman is to prevent her from seeing the world from her own perspective. But this is also where the secret lies and where feminism comes in, because what feminist does is insist that we do always place ourselves in the middle of our own perspectives. And people say that feminism, is a war against men and this and that. Feminism is not a war against men. It is a war against the silencing of women. And just like the sun, just like the moon does not seek to annihilate the sun, we're not seeking to annihilate men. But if men don't give us the space to speak from the center, then they do become the enemy. But ultimately, what we're trying to do is to illuminate the world and to make it a more just place, a more beautiful place, a place of a higher dimension that we can all live together in. Thank you.
Good evening. One of the first questions I got from a journalist after I published my novel Woman's Country in 2007, it was my debut, was this question. When are you going to write normal fiction? I'm not joking. This question really has been said. So this question, of course, baffled me. And I didn't know at that moment what to answer, since I did not know what normal fiction was. Why should literature be normal? I always thought that fiction and literature defied the norm, questioned normality. Nevertheless, this question made me feel quite uncomfortable because it questioned the art that I was doing. And in the following years, during interviews or debates, this question kept popping up once in a while, in some form or another. Yet it all came always to the same baseline, namely, when are you going to write normal fiction, normal literature? And the last time that this question was asked was a year ago in Antwerp, during a literary festival where somebody made a comparison with an Asian fiction writer who emigrated to Australia and who wrote in the beginning about the burden of immigration, but then evolved and wrote literature about white Australian. So the question that, to me, by one of the panelists, one of the participants, was if I could see myself make that kind of evolution. So here I was there in that panel. I was the only woman of color, and I'm sure I can assure you that was quite awkward. When a white man asks a woman of color about her evolution, her growth, her emancipation, watch out. So this question, of course, meant a lot of things, but a lot of bad things, mainly. If I wrote literature that was not normal, then what is normal literature? Had it to do with language? My mother tongue is Amazigh. It's a language that is spoken in North Africa. It's not Arabic. But I wrote in Dutch. And in the first years of my life as a writer, I've been called an allochthone writer. So did it mean that I wrote in an electron language? A language of an exotic faraway? I did not. I wrote in plain Dutch. So if it was not the language, could it be my characters? You know, was the norm then white women, white men going about living their normal European lives with pets and all the benefits of the Enlightenment and freedom and money? My characters had Arab names. I did not write about animals. Actually, I did in one short story, but unfortunately, at the end of the story, they died a gruesome death. And the characters I wrote about, they were men and women of color who sometimes had money, sometimes had nothing, sometimes they were free, sometimes they felt unfree. Whenever they ask me this question, I must think about the questions that a writer that I most admire has been asked during her career. Toni Morrison had questions like that. There was a journalist who almost as a reproach to her, saying, "So why are your books always about race?" To Toni Morrison, and Toni Morrison gave an answer as only Toni Morrison can give. She said, "I write about race because every book is about race." You know, if black people, brown people are race, then white people are race too. So Tolstoy wrote about race. Baudelaire wrote about race. And here in Flanders, Tom Lanois writes about race. So I wrote about characters who fell in love, grieved, and died just as a normal white character would do. The only thing that I wrote about differently, I think, is that I placed them in a world where they experienced exclusion, racism, and violence. I made my characters speak and react from an unprivileged position. And I guess that's one of the reasons that journalists and that panelists urged me to write normal fiction, because they could not connect with the experiences of my characters. I think there is also something much deeper than that in that question, because it's true, my characters defied the norm because they did not meet the prejudices that existed about them. Arab men, for instance. Everybody knows that Arab men are cruel, like super predators in real life and in normal fiction. But I wrote about Arab men who doubted themselves, who were a bit lost, who could be evil, of course, but nevertheless, they remained human. Arab women in normal life and in normal fiction mostly were victims of those evil Arab men, mostly. But I wrote about them as women with agency, women who make decisions for themselves, or women who didn't know what to do, just like in real life. So, from that point of view, of course, then it is what I write is not normal. It's a new kind of literature. So for me personally, writing as a woman of color in Europe is quite a journey. It's a work of reconstruction, deconstruction, but also reconstruction. I try to reconstruct, give words to a history, to a reality that is not too often written about. I write about untold stories. Most people do not know those stories, and people who do know those stories, it is interesting also that I write about that for them who already know, so that they will not forget. And we will not forget those stories because they are important. They are important because those stories, they show that there is a norm in the abnormality. And the norm in that abnormality is that we're all humans. We're all people, living beings. That's the norm. And everything around it and everything else is craziness, is abnormality, and it's great. Thank you.
Firstly, thank you so much to Suleiman and to BOZAR and to everyone for being so incredible and to allow me to speak. And then before that, I'd really like to give thanks to my mother, without whom I wouldn't be here, and all thanks goes to Allah. My mother is a mother of mothers. She bred a tribe, she raised individuals. Often she sacrificed peace and sleep. She gave birth to 12 children and raised 10. She was a second wife, and the rest of her life followed suit. She never was number one, never. I often think that I lost my mum to her sons. Somali mothers, they raise their boys with all the love that they have, and then they raise their daughters with whatever they have left over. I'm from a long lineage of poets. Somalia is known as the nation of poets. I really do believe that we invented the first battle, as in rap battle, like not just fighting. When tribes used to have conflicts, they would bring their best poets up to battle before they would fight. So you're welcome. So yeah, I learned everything I need to know about poetry from my grandmother. And there's nowhere else that I feel at home than back in my country. Yeah, the rest of the world would call me Amina Jama, but that wasn't the name that I was given. We had a conversation about names and how long they go on for. And my actual name is Amina, Ilmi, Aden, Jama, Ahmed, Saeed, Ahmed, Abakar, Umar, Tahir, Farah, Abdullah, Nuh, Mohamed, Jibril, Musa, Sheikh Ishaq, bin Ahmed, bin Hashim. Thanks. You can call me Amina. Yeah, I first started getting into poetry when I was about 6. I was writing about my experiences, about what it meant to be a girl, to be black, to be Muslim, and what it meant to have 10 brothers. And I thought songwriting was a lot cooler, so I said I was writing songs. And I first read out my poems in school. I started performing properly when I was about 17. Yeah, and I can never really answer when people ask me what I write about. Somewhere along the lines of dual nationality, culture, tradition, religion, womanhood, power, patriarchy, lessons, bodies, movements, vaginas, love, sex, intimacy, brotherhood, sisterhood, landscape, trauma. conflict, yeah, the list goes on and on and on. But centered in all of that is my mum. I go back to her constantly for all my lessons. I'm going to share 2 poems for you. The first one was the first poem I've ever read, and it's written after a Warsan Shiro poem about my body being a house. It's called Home to a Man. A home without breasts is just a house. Nooks and crannies need to be cleared. My mother once taught me never to be envious of others' houses. They only wish to break down yours. Men wish to break it down. I'm the lucky one, I know that much. But I can feel the paint peeling away from the bathroom walls. I don't know what I'll do when it finally falls. Nooks and crannies need to be cleared. Mama told me to never give away my spare keys, that it is sacred between God and I, but she makes a pair for any wealthy man arranging a visit. Mama refuses to buy sanitary towels in the household shopping. Asks, what will you do if your brothers see them? If they see that your house is dirty? She says, Hishod Naya. Have shame, girl. Nooks and crannies need to be cleared. I once turned off all the lights. I swear I felt my soul leave the house. I said, good for you, girl. You deserve to be happy. Nooks and crannies must be cleared, because when a man comes to view your house, it must be clean. Don't just sweep the dirt under the carpet, trim that rug. Make sure all your corridors are clear of impurities. Make sure your living room is presentable. It is the bosom of your home. Stay in the kitchen or the bedroom, Mama taught me, so he can watch you in your natural habitat. Mama taught me I must speak my mind, though every man is allowed to test out my home before he buys it. So if he wants to inspect, let him beg to witness all your rooms. And if he breaks down your walls, give in, baby. Mama taught me to be wary of handing him all my glory at once. He must also do some polishing of edges, she says. Nooks and crannies must be cleared, perhaps by a man. Thank you. The second poem is No Need. It's always hella awkward waiting for applause, because like that's just, I don't know, man, it's weird, isn't it? The second poem is, I wrote it for my nephew. My eldest nephew is 16, a very, very, very beautiful, gentle young man. Often when I think about the people that I love, it's women. And then I think about my nephews and I just think they're incredible. They're so full of life, and I want them to be safe and happy. And he had his first experience with the police recently, where he got arrested. And I asked him how he was feeling about it, and he said, at 16, he said that it was the first time he realized that he was feared. And I didn't know what to say to that. I had no idea what to respond, because part of me wants to be like, oh, no, I want to bubble wrap him and protect him. And then the rest of me is like, yeah. So I wrote a poem called God Bless Black Boys. Yesterday I got a call, one of those ring in your chest calls, from a mother. Said they killed her son, locked up her boy for lack of insufficient funds and whiteness. Said they knocked him over the head with criminalization, tagged his life. They were the rocky line, philosophizing on all Allah has done and all the faith this country undoes. Pray for me, please, she said. Maybe she was looking for a plane ticket in my silence, or some land, her dead husband to return, a weapon, a promise to Jannah, keys, a Ziploc case for her pain, anything to make the pain stop. But I'm just searching for missing black children. I'll make dua, I say. I want to say I can't sugarcoat the answer for you. This is how I feel. Someone killed my son, that means someone's getting killed. Tell me what you do for love. Tell me what you tell a boy who condenses himself, shortens his blackness to be palatable, finds friends who looks like him and is labelled a gang member. He's shotting, right? He must be trouble, right? He's just searching for air in the heat wave. I'd ride for my family, for my loved ones. Tell me what you'd do for love. Let someone touch my mum, touch my sister, touch my lover, touch my daddy, touch my niece, touch my nephew, touch my brother, touch my blackness. Today, I got a call from my mother. She said goodbye to her daughter. She left her for another. So she tried to protect them, brought them to the land labeled as free, put them in school, loved them with her work. I did everything they told me to do, she says. But I'm still left lowering their bodies. Got a call from her mother. Said she lost her brother. Didn't know she had him. I turned my phone on silent. I'm done grieving. Thank you.
Thank you, sisters. Thank you. Those were wonderful readings. I was almost 30 before I found my way to my life's calling. I had signed up with an employment agency in London that provided last-minute, temporary support staff to the publishing industry. I had recently quit a relatively well-paid job as an administrator to a city firm, and after family and friends had eventually persuaded me that a person like me, who spent all her spare time, and more money than she could really afford on books, should probably find a way to make this her living. And so I found myself at Penguin, then housed in a warren of offices in a building off of one of West London's busiest high streets. The offices were overcrowded, and there were books and files piled precariously along many of the office and corridor walls. I'm sure I remember a musty smell of old paper permeating the hallways. I was in a long-term assignment assisting the editor of history and modern classics, and one of my tasks was taking care of his mail. One particular day, a box arrived from the warehouse with copies of the latest book my boss had published, and he came out of the office, kneeling beside my desk to tear it open. He picked up one of the books out of the pile. He opened to about a third of the way through, pressed his nose to the pages, and inhaled. I remember staring at him, speechless. But then I must have made a sound because he looked up, asking me what was wrong. I thought I was the only person who did that, I whispered. I thought I was the only person who smelled books. He shrugged and went back to his office, leaving me to deal with the rest of the box. And even though in that crowded building within a publishing house that was home to at least a dozen imprints, mine was the only black face, even though I didn't at the time know of any other African transplants to London who worked in publishing, and even though I was now well past the first flush of youth with patchy work experience and 2 degrees from American universities that I hadn't really made much use of, even though I was only a temp and it would be almost a year before I found a permanent posting in the company, even though I suspected that many wondered what I was doing there at the desk where modern classics were declared and the canon produced. Despite all this, my boss opened the book, thumbed its pages, and smelled that intoxicating new book smell with a look of wonder in his eyes, and I knew that I had at last found my tribe. After that smelling of new books moment, I found myself determined to find a place for myself in this tribe of people who made books. I wanted to be the one walking out of an office to pick out a book from the box that I had made. I wanted that new book smell to be truly mine. But as I've said, it wasn't an environment that allowed me many, okay, let me be blunt, they weren't any, to my knowledge then, mirror images of myself that I could latch onto. So I felt at the time pretty much on my own in this quest. But I'm the product of a generation of Africans who never let something as trivial as, it's never been done before, or we don't have people like you here, to stand in their way. My grandmother was orphaned as a child and worked from her teenage years into early adulthood as a housemaid for a white family in what was then Rhodesia. She eventually went on to leave her job as a housemaid, got married, and had 7 children. She sold vegetables in the township market, crocheted delicate tablecloths and doilies, which she also sold. She brewed traditional beer and sold that. All of this industry to ensure that her children went to school. She would say of herself, "Handina angu kujgama bi." I don't have much education, or literally, I didn't swallow much of the alphabet. But this she could do. She could work, and she did. My life, my work, and my chosen tribe are very far away from my grandmother's market stall, and I have swallowed and digested that alphabet until words are at the very core of my being. I tried to imagine what my grandmother thought she was working for. She had no way of knowing where that education would take her children, what future she was preparing them for, but she did know that there was a world out there. She was curious about it and could imagine possibilities, and she wanted them. She wanted me to be ready for it. My second home in publishing was at Random House. I was senior editor at Jonathan Cape and had the great privilege of commissioning and editing both fiction and non-fiction. Considering that many, not all, but at least say 95% of the authors I had worked with on my previous job at Penguin Modern Classics were dead white men, I began this new job heady with the possibilities of having living, breathing authors. By this time, I had been around long enough to find at least a few of those mirror images I so longed for at the beginning of my career, and was fortunate to count the publisher Margaret Busby as a friend and mentor. With her encouragement and a postcard on my wall of Toni Morrison when she herself was senior editor at Random House, I set out to publish those books I most wanted to read. I knew by then that an editor has the power to shape culture. When I had looked at the modern classic bookshelves and wondered why there were so many Chinese, French, and German writers in translation, but no Africans, even though they wrote in English, I worked with colleagues to find a way to fix the deficit. But that by the time I left, that particular bookshelf was, to my mind, so much better looking, with new editions of Ngugi, Soyinka, Bessie Head, and Bamuzo Marechera, along with the other modern classics. Now, at my new job, I focused on finding those stories I was curious about that were not yet on the shelf. For example, where were the stories of the African men, such as my great-uncle Michael, who had fought in the Second World War? I searched and could only find chapters and scholarly works, or the occasional mention of these soldiers. My queries certainly didn't bring forth any works of fiction or full-length works of non-fiction for the non-specialist reader such as myself. After much snooping and poking around, I discovered that a Nigerian writer, B. Bandele, and a playwright who's also a playwright living in London, had received a grant to research this very subject as he prepared to write a novel based on his own father's experience. I published his book, Burma Boy, in 2007. The author was adamant that his book would need to have a Nigerian publisher too. Without a local champion and distributor, he argued, the book would not find its way to the people he had written it for, and if they did, only a few would be able to afford the price of a book imported from London. It was a challenge he set right at the point of contract, and I had to find a solution. We, my new tribe, had never done this before. But the head of international sales was a man gifted with a sense of the possible and set about devising an agreement for co-editions that has become an industry standard. We identified a Nigerian publisher, Muktabakare Farafina, and together brought that story that I had longed for to readers around the world. So much has happened since those early days in my career, and I'm aware that my allotted time is almost done. In 2017, in partnership with my friend and colleague Susie Nicklin and her own amazing vision, I was able to realize my ambition of truly owning that new book smell for myself when we founded the Indigo Press. Our first book was These Bones Will Rise Again, a feminist analysis and personal exploration of Zimbabwe's past and present. And we are, of course, the very proud publishers of the founder of this festival, the incomparable Salami Adonia. So I want to close inviting you all to contemplate with me the ideas and questions behind these stories I've shared. The idea that curiosity and a sense of wonder can indeed be a guiding principle, that we have to be bold in seeking out our place in the world, and to be fearless as we work to ensure that we claim the space for those stories we know need to be told. Thank you. I'd like to invite my four sisters to come and join me on the stage for a conversation.
Good evening, everyone. Can everyone hear me? I didn't introduce myself before. I'm Maaza Mengiste. It's such a pleasure to be here and to be on stage with these incredible writers and thinkers. I wanted to start off the conversation that we're having. After listening to everyone's talk and reading, I think one of the questions that came to mind is, I think one of the themes that we've seen here is the sense that writing creates a space for women, creates a space for different voices, forces conversation into places that maybe it did not exist. But I'm curious, as writers, as editors, for each of you, and maybe also for me, moments when literature, reading it, or either writing it, has surprised you. And we talk about, as writers, we create these spaces, we force boundaries to break apart. But when have we been surprised by that process ourselves? Myself, yourself. So maybe, yeah, that we can start with Amina and go down.
So is the question more about my writing or anyone's writing?
Your writing, or even someone you've read that has surprised you and helped open some spaces within your universe.
Amazing. I think that, so when I was studying in school, I genuinely didn't like poetry because it was dead white men that I studied. That was it. So I think the first time I was ever surprised by a piece of writing that I read was Toni Morrison, actually. And then Grace Nichols. I think I read the Fat Black Woman poems. And it was mostly black women when I started reading their writing, and I started access to internet, and I found this wealth of knowledge, and I found all of these texts that had stories that related to me, and stories that I could share to my family and I could share to my nieces, my nephews, and really, really excited me. I think it's really interesting that I've never actually been taught by a black woman or a woman of color, like ever. I'm studying creative writing at the moment at university. And in thinking about it, I've never been taught by a woman of color, all through secondary school, or through college, or through university. And I was thinking, there are women, there are academics. Where are they? But I found those stories in their writing, and that definitely excited me. And I think in terms of my own writing, probably the moment when I stopped caring what other people thought. Yeah, I think just the moment where I just thought, someone probably asked me who I was writing for, and I think I was so scared to say myself because I just thought that was a selfish thing to say. But the moment where I stopped caring, I was like, I'm writing for myself, and that excited me. Yeah.
the name of Toni Morrison fell here a few times this evening, so it's a grande dame of literature, and for me it was when reading Toni Morrison, but also Maya Angelou, that I discovered really a world that I could not imagine, and that was very important to me. Other writers that were important for me in non-fiction is the Moroccan sociologue Fatima Mernissi, feminist. And it's important because both what they did, Morrison, Maya Angelou, and Mernissi, was they gave words to a lived reality, a situation that you experienced as a young woman, but you could not bring it under words, and they gave words to describe this reality. And once you have the words and this situation is described in fiction or in non-fiction, then it becomes real, you know, because your own personal experience with injustice, discrimination, gender discrimination is a situation that is a fact, but it's very difficult to get a grip on it, to say, okay, this is not okay because of this reason, and we can put it in a frame where there is a history, where you can explain where it comes from, explain why people react that way, and explain that we have words to deal with it. We have words to fight it, to try to make, as you say, a better world for every one of us. And I think literature and non-fiction and good non-fiction really helps us, gives us the tools also to create that better world, I think.
Actually, I really love this question because you've just opened up like a new part of the writing puzzle for me. The word surprise is so incredibly central to writing and reading for me. And, you know, tying back to what you said about personal experience, because I think, you know, life is so fast-paced all the time that it can be really difficult to even know what we think about things half of the time. And writing is a place where it all comes out. At least that's how I feel. And so I think I quite often feel dread before I start writing, especially if I'm going to start writing about a new topic, because one thing that always happens, guaranteed, is that I'm surprised by either by how afraid I am of something, or how much more strong I am when it comes to a particular issue, or that I feel a certain way about something that I hadn't expected. And I would say that I have the same experience when I read. You know, sometimes there could be a book that I'm not supposed to like, but that I really enjoy, like, say, Joseph Conrad's Heart of Darkness. I actually really enjoyed reading that book, even though I disagreed with the politics of it. But I think it's great writing. Or a book that I am supposed to like, and I won't mention that one, of course, but that I didn't end up liking. So it's, yeah, like the whole process of writing and reading for me is about surprise.
So that was a lovely question. Thank you, Maaza. I have a Toni Morrison story to you, but I'm not going to tell that one. I wanted to talk about the first thing I thought of when you asked the question was being a young girl in school, and I had a teacher. It was I started secondary school at Independence, so we had our first elections when I was about 15, and I had a young white teacher who brought in, outside the syllabus, The Grass is Singing by Doris Lessing. And this was a humongous shift. My father's a writer and a publisher, so I'd grown up reading books from all over the world, including books from different African countries. I had never read a book in English that was set on the ground on which I stood. And for me, I suddenly thought, wait a minute, you can write about us here and now. And that was a major shift for me. And just to follow up on that, then when I started the Indigo Press in 2017, it was at the moment in time where the coup that was not a coup, if you remember that, where Mugabe was finally ousted. Not that much has changed, but anyway, that's another story. But it was just starting out at that moment, and I thought we could actually do our first book on Zimbabwe. And I found a young feminist novelist who I had met and knew had really interesting things to say. So we invited her to write our first book for us. And for me, that was a moment of not of surprise, but of possibility, because somehow the stars had aligned to put me in a space and to have met this person, for us to have the only work of nonfiction writing about Mugabe written by a young black feminist. And for me, that was just a humongous inspiration being able to do that.
I'd love to hear what you think.
Yeah. I guess I'll answer my question. In terms of, I guess, moments, a particular moment I was surprised, and it has shaped the novel that I'm finishing and will be out a little bit later this year, and I read the first page from it. The novel is set in 1935 during fascist Italy's invasion of Ethiopia. And for a long time, I grew up with stories of the heroism of patriots who fought against the Italians. And they were always stories of men who rose up and were courageous. And I lived in Italy for a while, looking through archives, searching for information about this story, remembering my grandfather's stories of his time during that era. And then at some point, I started looking at photographs taken by Italian soldiers, personal photographs that they kept, and then they would either send home or take with them once they returned from Ethiopia or Eritrea. And the one thing I started finding on a consistent basis were the photographs of women or girls, and in various states of undress. And these photographs were really uncomfortable to look at. And I thought at that point, I found my story, you know, what were women experiencing during this time. But at some point in my research in the archives, I started finding, only periodically, but sometimes a photograph of women with guns. A woman wearing a long abasha kameez, the traditional dress with a rifle. And at that point I said, oh, my God, of course. You know, women have always been fighters in wars, whether they were written about or not. And here is one clue. So in one sense, that was an awakening, that here's another side of this war. But, you know, it was still in some ways a story of courage and bravery and rising up. But one day on a visit a few years ago to Ethiopia, I was with my family. Everybody's sitting around and telling stories. And a story comes up of someone from the neighborhood that we know, a man who was relatively well off and who was quite old by that time. But someone started telling a story about how many children he had from all these different women. And when I leaned over and asked somebody, I said, how many times was he married or what? And so they laughed and they said, oh no, these were servants. And I was the one not laughing in that room. And I said, these women didn't have a choice then. This is not actually a funny story that we're telling here. This is not a story of masculinity. It is a story of masculinity, but this is really a story of patriarchy and abuse, and the way that money can silence women and class can silence women. So I took that back to my research, started looking at these photographs of women from Ethiopia and Eritrea and looking at these women who had the rifles and saying, what if their war was not with an enemy combatant? What if their war was with the men in their family and the men in the household? What do you do when women pick up a gun in a war and suddenly look at the man next to them and say, I want to kill you? So that became the basis of the book. And that was, for me, an eye-opener.
So I can't decide if I want to ask the question that's a little bit more heated or one. Maybe I'll save that one for later and start, because I'm also really dying to ask the other one, which I think is important, which is about how, being that we're all from different parts of the continent, I think we're representing North, West, East, South, and obviously our continent is in one of turmoil and there's a lot of suffering and struggle. As artists, do you feel a responsibility toward the political situations in your country, in our continent at large, or do you feel free to position yourselves as artists who produce for art's sake?
That's a brilliant question, and I actually don't think that you can have art that's coming from the continent that's not political. I think even if you write an erotic story, Chike read his amazingly delicious, naughty story this afternoon. A little bit freaky. Story this afternoon about two men in bed together. So that is an erotic story, but it's absolutely political. There's no escaping it. You can write
What do you feel made it political?
It's political because it's the idea of, okay, these are two men in bed together. So what are the politics around that? How are you dealing with sexuality, identity, and rights, and so on? You can have a crime novel set in Johannesburg, and there the politics of race and of apartheid and so on. You have Maaza's story. You have Amina's poetry, and each and every poem that she has read over the last 2 days has had a strong political element. I think the reality of our lives on the continent and in the diaspora indeed makes all of our art political, and therefore it makes it urgent and necessary.
Yeah, following on from that, I think writing is survival, like often. I don't think that strays away from politics. I write so much about Somalia just because I love it. It's so ingrained in my body, in my thoughts, in my writing, in everything that I do and say. But I don't necessarily like the people that run the country, like, at all. I never have. And I think recently, a couple of years ago, there was the first lady that tried to run for parliament in Somalia, and regardless of her policies and how educated she was, she never got into power because no one wanted to vote for a woman. That was it. Everyone just said, I'm not going to follow a woman. And I think that is, I think that's really interesting because I think in families, everyone thinks that the men do have the power. But I think mothers run the household. Mothers run everything. In my family specifically, my mum 100% does. My only living grandparent is my grandma. She has 8 kids, 52 grandkids, 116 great-grandkids. She's incredible. And writing about all of that, I think that is political because it's writing about the time that she grew up in. It's writing about the war that she lived through. It's writing about the people that she lost, the people that she met along the way. When I went to Somalia when I was 16, my auntie took me and she drove us around the country, and it was really beautiful. And she stopped us at like this dead end in the middle of nowhere. And she said, okay, go through that little tunnel. It was into a cave. And she said, this is where I hid when I fled. and I had my kids with me, and she remembers, like, she painted a beautiful image of like the village that was there, and she was talking about the fact that Siad Barre, the dictator at the time, ordered soldiers to round up the families in the village, dig a hole, put the people in the hole, and bury them alive. And writing about that, writing about my country, is political. Like, you can't stray away from it. I can't stray away from being black. I can't stray away from being Muslim. That's nothing that I can. Yeah, that's always going to come up in my writing. And I think, writing is survival. Surviving is political.
Yeah, I totally agree with you that writing is survival. And I think for me also it is an act of self-determination. You use your voice to make clear that you are here and that you do not agree with the position that you are put in and that you want to change that. So you do that. I do that as a child of immigrants who came from Morocco to Belgium. As a minority here, so we have a lot of political issues, a lot of racism, a lot of inequality. So I don't think that it's possible for me to write and making abstraction of that context. So that context is determinating or very important in my work, and it's also important in everything that happens in Morocco, for instance. I come from the north of Morocco, the region where the last 2-3 years now there is an uproar and protest in the street for social justice, for people who claim that the government must invest, must come build hospitals, come build schools, universities, so that people can live as human beings. And that is something that I think is important also to support from here. I think it's much easier for me to speak up than for people there, because if they speak up there in the streets, well, they will get arrested and they will go in prison. And we have a lot of young men, mainly, but also some women, who have been arrested and put in jail and had received severe sentences just for speaking out and just for coming out in the street in a non-violent manner, and they have been arrested. So if they use their liberty to speak up, there is a price to it, as well as when I will do it, or people of the diaspora will do it here, the risk is much lesser. So I think it's important to have that solidarity, to be with them and speak up whenever injustice is there, because we don't have the luxury to write art or to do art for the art's sake. You know, a lot of people think that when art is political, then it's not real art, and it's activism, and that it's so. I don't believe that. I think we cannot have art in a kind of a neutral environment. We are the product of our society, and it has an impact on who we are and what we do. And I think for me personally, writing is really an act of self-determination and a political act. And I think it has a value. It gets meaning when you can link it to struggles of equality, struggles against racism, against Islamophobia. I think it has a deeper dimension if you connect it to that.
I've been thinking a lot about this question of the place of a writer, of an artist in these very political times that we're living in. I keep thinking about the way that the United States watches Russia to see how far they can push something, and the way that Brazil is looking at the US to see how far they can push something, and the way that Turkey is looking at, Saudi Arabia or vice versa, and the way that all these dictators and these different regimes watch each other and take notes. And I've been thinking lately a lot about the ways that those of us who care about justice and human rights and liberty can look at each other and take notes from each other in the same way that these regimes are doing. Why is it that my concern would necessarily only be in Ethiopia or only be in the United States? Why can't I look at what's happening in France, for example, right now with the protests that are in Paris, and learn from them and try to communicate with them the way that these fascists are talking to each other in different ways. So when I think of my place as a writer, I'm thinking of it in this world, in this moment, across boundaries, across borders, that we have to think about citizenship in a completely different way, because the world we're living in is collapsing under these lines that is not going to soon afford us the privilege of saying, I'm only this. And so I think that as artists, as writers, as activists, we have to be in the forefront to blur all those lines, because I think the leaders that we have are telling us we are one thing, and we need to remind them that we are many things.
No, not really, but I'll try. Okay. It's actually a really difficult question for me because, as I described during my talk, I definitely started writing because of my sense of protest against the society that I lived in. And so I guess the very beginnings of my life as a writer have to do with a kind of activism and a political resistance. But somewhere along the line, I discovered, I guess, that I actually am in love with the art form and with words. Like, I could read a dictionary for days, you know, and I really enjoy the poetry and, yeah, just basically the art form. But what I think matters when it comes to this question is perhaps the redefining of art. Because I do think that it is important that all of us here and all African artists and all artists can create art for art's sake. I think that's incredibly, that's vital. But what we think of as art is too narrow. And I also think that there is an intersection, perhaps, between the artist and her role as a citizen. Because I think that as a citizen, I feel a responsibility, first and foremost, for my country. I mean, even my city, my municipality, and I have many of them now because I've moved around. And I have that sense of responsibility, which I think I would have if I were, whatever my profession was. I think each one of us in this room, in the world, especially because of the times that we live in, has a responsibility to speak up. But then as a writer, when I sit down and I'm writing, even if it is about a social issue, there is a moment when that side of my persona, the citizen side, is just switched off. And all I care about is whether the word aqueous or watery is more important. Do you know what I mean? Like, I don't care if I'm trying to describe an environmental issue, but the actual creation of something beautiful matters. And maybe, I mean, because art and beauty are usually tied together, so maybe we also need to reclaim and redefine what we mean by beauty, because change, transformation, revolution, these are all things that I think are beautiful. They are art. So, thanks.
To the audience, and I think I can't see though. I think it's Raphael has a microphone, and we'll pass it on to you if you have questions.
Yes.
Thank you so very much. First of all, I want to say thank you to all of you for coming. This has been such an illuminating experience for me. And Ellah, thank you for creating a gate. I've always wondered about gatekeepers and telling us no. And so I'm so happy that you've built a gate for us African writers. But my question for all of you is if you could just talk to us about your process of dealing with no and rejection, especially when it comes to telling stories that you believe are important for us, but maybe the gatekeepers around you don't see the value of those stories in these times.
Well, dealing with no, I have a lot of experiences with that. And it makes you a stronger person. But the thing is that it's a reality that the stories that I want to write and tell, they're not considered to be the norm and what is usually norm, and so it's a lot of time it is also treated like that. You know, it's not only a question of a stupid journalist, but I just published my latest last novel in September last year. And it's about an Amazigh boy, a young man who fought during the First World War in the north of France. And I thought it was important to tell that story because, you know, we are celebrating the 100th anniversary of that First World War. And I thought that the story of men who fought this war and coming from the colonies, ex-colonies, for instance, that story is not told or not enough. And even in the commemoration of that war, we do not see that story. So I think it's unjust because a lot of men died there for Europe, for the Western world, and they are not getting the credits for it. I'm not saying that we have to cheer because they came in and fought and died, but we have to tell their stories. I think we're obliged to do that, to give them the place they deserve on the scene of history and in the collective narrative and so on and so on. And it did not happen. So I wrote a book about that, and I think it's important to tell that story. And you see that well, the book is published and everything, but it did not get the attention that other books, for instance, had Flemish books, Dutch books that are about the same topic, and books mainly written by white middle-aged men who get invited, who get interviews, and you see that they're not. A lot of people are not interested in that kind of story because it's not their story; it's the story of the others. So, and then why should we give them space and time? We have our own stories, so let's give them space and time. And I think that is something that is very hard, and I think I'm very happy to hear that you have a publishing house in London that opens up to that kind of writers. But we have to go a bit further, you know. We have to have media platforms, television, who really see the importance to tell different stories, to open up and not to be just focused on the self all the time, to put oneself all the time in the middle of the world. You know, there is a lot of stories. They deserve to go from the margin to the center. And how do we do that? We have no power in media. We have no power in television, in journals, in papers. We have an editing house, but I think it's not enough. We have to make sure that we are heard. If we tell stories, I don't write for myself. I write for a public, for people. So I want to be heard. I want to be read. And I ask to be from the margin put in the center. So how do we do that?
Thank you for that question. And I do want to follow up with what Rachida is saying, because I agree with you that it's not just enough to open the gate. Where I don't agree is that we don't have the power. I think that we do have the power. If we ask the African women in this audience alone what they did, I'm sure we can start to zero in on those centers of power that we need. It's about how we use them. It's also about not asking for permission. Somebody asked me why I had left mainstream publishing, and I said I was just hitting my head against this glass ceiling, and then I looked up one day and thought, but wait a minute, if I step outside, the sky is blue. And as you can imagine, it was terrifying. But for me, it was a point at which I no longer wanted to ask permission, because we know what needs to be done. We also know how to do it. And so it's about claiming that power and saying that I don't need your permission to tell the story. Here it is. And, you know, a lot of it is a hustle, and it's very difficult. Completely granted. My sister has a very good analogy. She says, you don't ask for a seat at the table. You go into the forest, you chop down the tree, you craft that chair, and you bring it to the table. And for me, that's really important. I find that really inspiring. Sorry to the...
I just wanted to add that I think there was a quote by Issa Rae that I'm going to paraphrase, where she says about the fact that people always want to work with someone more successful than them, and they always want to thrive to find the best. But like you're right, we do have each other. Like everyone has a friend who is interested in film. Everyone has a friend who's interested in writing and journalism, who writes blogs. Support each other. I feel like people don't support their friends enough. I think they'll write for their friends offline, but not online. And I think, yeah, it's just about like actually finding each other and finding your peers and using your peers.
I think it was James Baldwin, because it sounds like the kind of thing he would say, but it's something along the lines of, in an insane world, to be called sane would be an insult. And I think, to me, that is the kind of direction I'd go with this question, is in a world which is racist and white supremacist and sexist and patriarchal and homophobic and capitalist, no is a yes for me, because my work is resisting all of that. But at the same time, of course, we all have to survive, and we do want our art to be read by others and so on and so forth. But I do think, to echo what has already been said, we have to understand that we live in times of so much privilege, especially, I mean, every single one of us in this room has access to these kinds of talks, to the internet. You know, I'm reading a book by Zora Neale Hurston at the moment, and I'm just so incredibly awed by how creative and how beautifully she wrote in circumstances where, you know, a black person could not even get on a goddamn bus with white people, you know, like there were so many obstacles that we don't face today. And so I think we just have to really go ahead and use the tools that we have. But it's, yeah, going back to the thing of a no being a yes. I mean, when I was sending out my book proposal, so many publishers said things like, this is too African. Like, I got that a few times. And I mean, it's harrowing because this is what people still think, but it really meant for me that I'm going to write one hell of an African book. Yeah.
And very quickly, I think now that you've said that, Minna, Ellah was the editor for my first book, the UK publication. Speaking of no's, maybe this is, I mean, my personal experience was that, from that, was that I was getting all these rejections for the book because it was about Ethiopia, it was about revolution, and revolution is violent, and nobody wanted to touch that kind of story. But Ellah was very willing to take that on. And then right when the book was being published, there was just this, it's not a resurgence, but there was just this wave of books that were being published suddenly by writers from the African continent. So a couple of things with that. If those books hadn't been written years before sometimes, there would not have been that wave. That if I had been completely discouraged, and I was discouraged enough as it was, but if I had been completely discouraged by the feedback I was getting on the book, even as I was writing it, it wouldn't have been done for Ellah to say, yes, I'll take it on. And I think our responsibility, those of us who have had the privilege to in some ways get a foot in a door, is to now hold that door and bring someone else in. And I can't remember who said this quote, but it's something that I keep in mind, that we are the ones we've been waiting for. Alice Walker, that it's us, nobody else. And so all of us who have that privilege that Minna said, to be here, to have some kind of an employment, to have some kind of tool of expression. Now the thing is to turn around and bring at least one person forward, because we can do it to create the next wave. It wouldn't have happened if all of these writers from Africa hadn't already been writing for years. None of this would have happened for everyone else, including me.
Any other questions from the audience? I think we have a little thing. Is there any ladies?
Hi everyone, my name is Tracy Mika. Thank you for letting me talking, and I apologize for my accent, but okay, that's perfect, thank you. To introduce myself, I'm a student. I'm studying law here in Brussels, and also write for the journal of ULB, for the African associations, and also I'm an ambassador for ADIFE, for Diaspora Vote. And what we are doing with Diaspora Vote is that we're trying to get the people who are Afro-descendants more involved in the political stuff, and we're trying to encourage them to get in politics. I'm really, how can I say this? I'm really motivated in, how do you say this? In the question of black, and I'm also a feminist. I'm doing a black feminist formations, and I'm also a lot faced to criticize, like, how can I say this? People who try to stop you from doing what you think is good. Like, people try to stop you, to tell that you should not being too into this, or you shouldn't being too involved in this, because it's not going to give you opportunities, and you're going to stop you for your career and stuff like this. And the question I was asking is, how can you handle the fact that there is a lot of people who criticize the fact that you're a black woman, you try to make your place in the world, and you try to be in place that people don't want you to achieve. So how can you handle with the fact that maybe the position that you want is not a position that people want you to be there, and you always face critics and in this world? So this is my question. What are your keys?
mind my language, but fuck them. Like, they're not trying to save you from being hurt. They're trying to hold you back. Like, that's it. And I think exactly what you said about building that seat for yourself. Like, you will get there. You will get there. Just fuck them. Genuinely, that's how I really feel like that. Sorry.
And I think in order to fuck them, so to speak.
Yeah, please be more nuanced.
Hey, now we can all start cussing, right? No, but you have to develop a really strong sense of self. I think once you have that, I always say, cultivate a mind that cannot be manipulated. So that no matter where you are, no matter who you're around, you know who you are and why you're there and what you're doing. So that's a very important trait to develop, but it's also a very difficult one. But what is important that we understand as Black women is that we all go through that. You know, it's a journey that is equally a struggle as it is a joy. It's all about constantly having to resist, to grow, to learn, to be bold, to be courageous. You know, all of these things, we just can't get away from that. But you're never alone in facing those challenges. I go through it, she goes through it, we all do. But eventually you create that mind that can't be manipulated, and then you can go anywhere in the world.
I completely agree with what my sisters have said, and I would say to you is read books. Because if that Black woman isn't standing next to you to whisper in your ear, then you can find her on a bookshelf, and she'll sustain you for as long as you need her to.
Oh, and
So what I also want to say is to keep your eye on the prize, you know. You know where you want to go, so that is your goal, and let no one distract you. You have that thing before you, that goal, that prize, and that's where you want to go. You will make it if you concentrate, be alert, and continue your journey.
oh, and I also have a second question. Sorry. Okay.
There's one on this row, and then the lady at the back, and then because we're getting way ahead.
Okay. Hi, my name is Moha, and I live in London, and I like to say I'm ex-Nigerian because I feel I've self-exiled myself. And what I mean by that is that I grew up on the continent, and I love it when I hear people say, "Oh, my favorite place is my home country. My favorite place is not Nigeria." Like, and it's it's just not. And what I find frustrating is you have to you deal with race and the context of race within the diaspora, and you have to explain these things. But then, like Africans or Nigerians on the continent who are of a certain class just have no perception of race, and also they don't see the importance of what you're talking about. And this is the most frustrating thing of all the frustrating things in the world. I can explain to someone who's from a different perspective because they don't see it. But my question basically is, do you have the time or do you have the energy to explain to people on the continent? Because I believe you all travel home at some point. I've lost the ability or desire to. I find it just almost it's pointless. Do you? This is the same thing I found. This is the first thing I realized I was Black when first time I lived abroad. But then you're Black because you're African, right? When you go to that Africa and then you don't realize you're Black as well, there's a slight disconnect.
It's possible to be multiple things.
Absolutely.
And to have your identity have multiple meanings that if I'm in Ethiopia, we're not having a discussion necessarily of Blackness, but the conversations that need to happen there really focus on ethnicity and religion.
Yes.
And those things, and that is just as important as conversations I have in the US on race. But one does not negate the other.
No,
and it doesn't necessarily...
I'm saying all those other topics, like racism, homophobia, everything that's wrong, they just don't engage with it. Racism is the first one, but yes. Perhaps, but this is my point. This is my point. I'm surrounded by these wrong people back home. So it feels reductive there. I'm not saying there's no one else like that, but as a whole, because I grew up there, the people who I go back to. So how do you engage with them? Because I see that it's pointless. You see what I mean? And then they control the country, they will run the country. And then this is why we remain in that point.
I mean, I share your frustration. I spend a lot of time back home in Nigeria.
Yes.
And I actually really share your frustration with the reluctance to understand blackness.
Yes.
As one thing, and then the homophobia and the sexism and all of that, classism, etc. But I react to it differently, and maybe that is because Nigeria has also given me so much, and I feel that it is important for me to be there to shape some of the discussion and to learn from the discussions that are happening there. And one of the things that I really try to push, and I guess I have a slightly different view when it comes to the understanding of blackness being more important than the diaspora, because I think that I think blackness is more important than Africanness. I think we were black before we were African. That's a relatively, I don't think, I mean, this is a fact. Africa is a relatively modern invention. And I think that we lose, I think a lot of our issues in the African continent, in Black Africa anyway, have to do with our lack of engagement with the concept of blackness. And perhaps in the diaspora, it would be with the lack of engagement of Africanness, because within these terminologies is where we find the unity that we so desperately need. But yeah, my reaction is just that I want to be there. I want to have these discussions. I don't want to abandon them, because I also think that that is part of the Western narrative that sort of encourages us to do that. I don't want to attack you personally.
It makes total sense. This is, that's
it's really part of the decoy, is that we become these people who say, no, I can't deal with us because we're so backward.
Yeah.
No, like we have to do this.
Yeah, this is great. Thank you.
Hi, good evening. It's absolutely wonderful to listen to you all representing different parts of the African continent and different parts of the African diaspora as women creatives. And I want to ask you, are you able to create opportunities for yourself to make these kinds of connections for yourselves as artists? Because it's great for us to watch it. The young lady's question demonstrates that we also can learn from you, and you can be some of the mirrors that we need to see to feel inspired by. But in your work life as artists, are you able to create such moments?
I forgot I'm not in my living room. Thank you for your question. It's a good reminder. In response, these situations and these friendships are absolutely sustaining. It's otherwise impossible. And I think that this young lady as well, when she asked, you need to know that you don't reach the age of 52 and find that suddenly it's all easy. It remains as difficult. You just have better ways of dealing with it. And one of the ways of dealing with it is having other women of color who you can talk to. I have a publisher friend, and often we'll speak at 2 a.m. in the morning saying, you'll never believe what happened to me in the sales meeting. And she will relate the experience. Sometimes she'll just say, fuck 'em. Or sometimes she'll say, babe, you're amazing. It's completely sustaining, and they're absolutely vital to any of the work that we do. I don't know.
Yeah, we were having this conversation earlier today about the communities that we build. I know I have them. When I have a question, I know people that I can call. And part of it is we were talking and really just telling each other, well, if you know somebody who has a question that I can answer, send them to me. And this is how the community grows. And I think it's as easy as sometimes starting a WhatsApp group, right, with people and saying, ask a question, there might be someone here that can help you. And I think that's how I get my support from people I can reach out to by phone or by email.
Yeah, similar. I think if you don't ask, you don't get. So I have a friend here who's an incredible writer, and when she was telling me a story about how she got a mentor, she literally went up to him and said, you're going to mentor me. And that was it, and she did. when I first started applying for projects, I think I was about 17. No, I was 15. Got rejected at 15. Got rejected at 16. Third year, I was like, if I don't get in, then that's it. And I got in, and I was like, I'm going to use this. I'm going to milk it. I'm going to get every contact, and I did. And honestly, use every opportunity as a networking opportunity, because there's someone there that's going to be, that you're going to be of benefit to them. They're going to be of benefit to you, and you can have those conversations. And Twitter is amazing. Social media is amazing. Sending emails. I send tons of emails constantly. I think I just bug people all the time, and then just like, yeah, sure, you can do whatever you want. But I really genuinely, if you don't ask, you don't get. Yeah.
Well, it's not a question actually, but it's. I just hope that people in the audience, because I really, really enjoyed the conversation. And I think something that she asked over there, like how do you, handle rejection, or, people not accepting you, or maybe even encouraging or not encouraging you. I think that one of the things that Ellah is doing is trying to take that toxicness away. And that's, I think, what we should be building on. Like, I really, really hope that generations after us don't have to deal with it, and that we don't have to keep saying, just push through and just, just keep trying and your eye on the prize and all that, because I think it's not fair to just always be in that condition. So I just wish that, I hope that everybody in this audience will start connecting and do whatever you're doing and start building all these types of networks. Yeah.
Last question?
Hi, everyone. Thank you for being here. What I would like to ask is that from several stories that I've heard and witnessed from women, especially from color, they're dealing a lot with shame as an obstacle towards visibility, as an obstacle towards just being recognized and acknowledged in their own cultures as much as outside in the world that they are living in. And I was wondering if this one has ever happened to you, that you are also surprised by the fact that you are conditioned to stay invisible and to stay silenced, and how you broke that. So you've also, you mentioned the glass ceiling. And second, how do you encourage other women to do the healing process, to acknowledge that shame is part of the weapons that are being used towards us as women to stay small, and how to acknowledge the learning curve and the growth in that.
Thank you. It's really important to acknowledge that sense of shame. It comes in so many different ways. Just following on from what the lady said earlier, just the question before yours, it's really important that when we learn something, we let others know what we've learned. Because that way the next person, the girl coming behind me, doesn't have to learn it again. She already knows it, and she will leap far beyond me. And that's where silence comes in, because the more we talk to each other and pass on the knowledge, the more we're not constantly reinventing things so we're always the first one. I don't want to be the first one next time around. This girl has to then be the second one and then the third one, because then we become powerful. So the silencing is about taking away our power. And the more that we speak out, the more that we gain power generation upon generation, until we get to the point where it's no longer that same struggle. It's a different one.
Yeah, and going off of what Ellah said, I'm reminded of this quote by art critic John Berger in his novel G, who said that never again will a single story be told as if it's the only one. And for a long time, I had that on my computer, or next to my computer as I was writing. That, and my sense of that is that as we share our stories, we help remove ourselves and other people from that feeling of isolation, which is where shame comes from, which is where fear comes from. We think our pain is special. We think our shame is unique. We think our fear is the only one until somebody speaks their story. And then we realize we're not alone. And if we can continue to do that, then it's not one person starting all over again from what someone else did already. And I think, you know, fear works in abstraction. If it works only when we don't have the words to name it and to claim it. And so as writers, as activists, if we name it, you've already contained it. And that's what we have to keep doing.
I think what you said was so beautiful, and I guess just to add to that, you know, shame is it's a human emotion. It's not a female emotion. Everybody feels shame from time to time. That said, of course, women are socialized into feeling shame about specific things. So I guess I would go back to what I was saying about cultivating a mind that can't be manipulated, which part of the hard work in doing that is finding out what kinds of situations cause shame, just like, you know, fear and all of these kind of awkward, uncomfortable emotions. And just as you were saying, once you can name it, once you understand where it's coming from, what kind of systemic, like what part of shame is coming because of the societies that we live in, and what part of my shame is simply because I'm a human being, you know, then you can operate from a much stronger place with it.
No, we actually had an uprising, so we got one more question. So people like, so we got one more. Liz, no, you want to ask? Yeah. Okay. So anyone? Last one? Okay.
Hello. I'm here with a classmate friend of mine, and we are in school. I'm from the United States, she's from South Africa, and we've had a lot of moments where we've bumped up against issues in school that have affected us specifically because of our Blackness, because of our womanhood. And I guess I'm just wondering, from the stories that you all are telling, I'm guessing that you've had to pick a lot of fights in life or not based on those same issues, your color, your gender, and I'm just wondering, how do you go about, specifically you all, choosing when you're going to pick those fights and not, especially when it's in a position where it can directly affect your career?
I think that is a very difficult question, very hard question, because those fights, as you call them, they are really energy consuming, and if you engage in that kind of debate or talking back or trying to explain, I experience that as something that can put you away from your own agenda, your own goals, your own ambition, and then you could spend a lifetime arguing and explaining and trying to make people see that the way they look at situations, the way they look at the others is wrong, and at the end there is not a lot of that you achieve, because it's very, very difficult to make people change their mind. And is that what I want? I do not want to put my energy in people so that they can change their mind, especially not if they are of a certain age, they have diplomas, they are smart. I'm willing to do that. I go to speak in schools, for instance, and then I have an audience of young people, and I think, yes, with young people we can engage in that conversation, because a lot of young people are eager to know, are curious, are open-minded, and a lot of older people are not. They believe in their own truth. So am I willing to spend my energy that is valuable? I need that energy to make my own projects, to make my own agenda. Am I willing to use that energy in engaging in that kind of discussion where I know that it will not bring a lot, give me a lot back? So that is a very difficult situation. But of course, when a situation is unjust, you have to speak up when that unjustness is hurting not only you, but hurting a bigger community. And for instance, I'm also a lawyer, so we have in this country, well, a neoliberal nationalistic direction that we are taking the last years, and our legislation is also very dangerous in the fact that we have now legislation that is really racist and really excluding and discriminating people on basis of their religion, ethnicity, nationality, and so on. So if you see things like that happen in your society, then you must speak up, then you must do something with any means that you have to your disposition. You have to act. Then it's not an option to remain silent. Then you have to get on the streets, do something, go to courts, fight those kind of measures and laws, so that bigger harm can be prevented. But you have to choose your battles, that for sure.
I think maybe this is a good time, a good place to wrap things up. But thank you all for your thoughtfulness and listening and asking questions and helping us on this fantastic panel tonight. Thank you to everyone here, and thank you to Suleiman and Raphael and all the people also who organized this.
That's actually great, thanks. Can we, one more round of applause to all the technicians, please? Thank you. Also, to Raphael, who helped with the production, you've been incredible, thank you. I would like to thank Elena and Ayoka from the Afro-Policing team, please. Thank you. I also would like to thank Excel Commune, who've been incredibly supportive of this festival. Bas, Els Goose is here as well. Please, round of applause. And I want to thank all the speakers. Thank you so much. I know, you came from the United States, from Sweden, London, and I know that Maaza and Minna, you've just about to finish your book, so I'm really grateful here to be here. It's really great to have you. I think this is dead now. I just want to say, can I just admit that I don't think I've cried like I had since yesterday and today. And that's because literature is basically my first love, and I think it will be my last love. People, when I tell them a little bit about my story, the fact that I was exiled when I was 2, and I was without parents from the age of 3, they see the tragedies, which is actually, it's a very tragic situation. But then for me, what I have started to realize, actually, there are advantages to that. And one of them being to have fallen in love with literature. I'm somebody who was left alone, and so I've learned a lot from books, and so I'm not a person without weaknesses, because my teachers were characters in novel, and all of them were flawed characters. But the most important thing, I think, when we talk about how this world is shit, it's fucked up, you know, and then people say, oh, let's go to Planet Earth. I would say, no, let's go to Planet Literature. Yes, and so really it's just given me huge pleasure to have created all these events, and to you as well. You know, you could have gone to somewhere else, dancing, music, whatever. You came here, and really thank you so much. Thank you to the speaker, and thank you to everyone here. Thank you so much.
It did. I was